Texas. Mr. Gohmert is recognized for the remainder of the hour as a designee of the Majority Leader. $36 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do appreciate the words of my friend from Oregon. These are difficult times, and it even is more difficult when unfairness comes from the United States government with all its power, with all its resources, when it begins to pick on American citizens, when it uses its resources to snoop on Americans, especially when it uses resources to spy on Americans in order to help maintain power of the government over the people. One of the problems with Obamacare provides every American's medical records to the federal government, as if the federal government didn't have enough personal information. Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, they've in the process of gathering people's credit card, debit card information, supposedly to protect individuals. And what we've seen in our Judiciary Committee, as we've had hearings on the abuses by federal government bureaucrats, is there seems to be this desire among different agencies and departments. They have no business having a SWAT team, but they want one. They want military power to go out and take people down whenever they get ready. And one of the things for many years that Congress has not done an appropriate job of keeping in check is criminal laws. There are far too many criminal laws, the number of which we don't know exactly, but which allow a violation of a regulation to be a crime, which allows the full power of the federal government to go after individuals. So we heard the horror story about a fellow from the Northwest trying to create a better battery. He gets run off the road by 3 black Suburbans, hauled out of his little gas-efficient car, thrown down on his chest, boot in the back, handcuffs on, had no idea what he'd done, never even had a traffic ticket. Turns out he hadn't violated any law necessarily, but he had mailed a package to Alaska that he knew needed to go by ground only, so he checked the box, ground only. He didn't know that he needed a little sticker with an airplane with a line through it, so he didn't put that on. And the result was he was run off the road, thrown to the ground, handcuffed, drugged to jail, then drug off because the federal government gets to pick their venue, and since they knew he didn't really know people in Alaska, and that's where the package was going, they drug him to Alaska to prosecute there. When he was finally acquitted, maybe it was jury nullification, they just thought it was too unfair, then the prosecutors, the power of the federal government, and the vindictive people that control things decided they couldn't let him get away with only having done months in jail. So, having ransacked his home under a search warrant because he didn't put the little sticker on the packaging mailed, they went back through all of the accounting of items found, the inventory, and found that there were some chemicals that are required not to be abandoned, and a regulation, again, regulation, so that's put in place, not Congress, but that required those substances were never to be left for more than 14 days. And since the prosecutors had him drug off to Alaska, put in jail up there, he was involuntarily forced to leave the substances. They were properly stored, but they were successful in prosecuting him for abandoning the substances. Or the retired gentleman down in Houston who wasn't able to testify before our committee because he had had a stroke while he was incarcerated because of the over-aggressive prosecution by the federal government. He had a greenhouse, raised orchids, sold to some local florists, gotten a package from South America. Apparently it wasn't properly packaged according to some bureaucrats' regulations, and therefore he had his home raided, ransacked. His wife testified she called home, didn't recognize the voice of the person answering. She asked who it was. He said, "Well, who is this?" She said, "I called my home, talked to my husband, and I have a right to know who you are." Well, it was a federal agent. He was handcuffed in his own kitchen because somebody sent him a package from South America that didn't meet some cubicle jockey's idea of what was properly sending a package. And during a year and a half imprisoned, he had a stroke, couldn't communicate. Or the poor guy that had lobster shipped to him that he was arrested, incarcerated, charged with violating not American law, but American law that says if you violate a foreign law, then you can be arrested in America. And they alleged that he violated Caribbean islands laws. And that country's attorney general said, no, we don't believe he violated our laws. Nonetheless, he was incarcerated. I mean, the stories go on and on of abuse when a government becomes all-powerful the way this one has come close to being. And when Congress doesn't adequately rein it in, doesn't seem to be a lot of hope for Americans across the country to be able to stand in the face of such an overwhelming power as our federal government. So I appreciate a friend from Oregon talking about the situation with the Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service. It seems that there are people within the Interior Department that have an insatiable appetite for acquiring more and more and more land, more and more private property taken away from private individuals. It's getting out of control. And if any landowner dares to say, I want to keep my own private property, then they can have a right to worry that the federal government will come after them and harass them, make their lives miserable until they finally consent. It's why we should have removed the president's ability to just name land as a national monument, as President Clinton did, one of the world's largest deposits of coal in Utah, just put it off limits by calling it a national monument. It was never intended for those purposes. That's why we should have ended, well, actually it had ended, the program that allowed billions of dollars to be accumulated and spent buying more and more land for the government to control. It's very difficult in my district. It's not like the federal government owns one big swath of land. It can surround private property, make the lives of private property owners miserable, make it unbearable, being a horrible neighbor. So even if the federal government doesn't own the private property, they can make usage of that property very unpleasant. So is it any wonder right now in America that Donald Trump is Republican primary in so many of the polls? Ted Cruz, who's viewed as an outsider, though he's in the Senate, because he stood up against the establishment, the status quo. Americans are tired of the federal government being unaccountable and becoming so big that it's out of control. Having prosecuted felony cases early in my career, having been a judge handling thousands of felony cases in Texas, I understand crime. I understand how it has to be stopped. But I also see when the federal government becomes a part of the problem instead of part of the solution. When we had this horrendous shooting in San Bernardino, so many people killed at a Christmas party, or this administration prefer to call it a holiday party, where Christians, Jews, get singled out. Of course, this administration won't prosecute a hate crime against a Christian or Jew, but and then continue to warn us that they certainly will protect against any hate crime against Muslim. Nonetheless, we find out there was a straw buyer who broke the gun laws to buy a weapon for the killers. We don't need a new gun law. The man violated the gun laws. And then we find out that actually this administration has been prosecuting fewer gun violations than the Bush administration, and in recent years continues to prosecute fewer and fewer and fewer gun violations. And if one were cynical, especially in view of the Washington adage that no matter how cynical you get in this town, it's never enough to catch up. If one were cynical, you might say, wait a minute, this administration, for example, compared to the Bush administration, 2004, Bush administration prosecuted nearly 9,000 gun violations, brought cases brought by the ATF. This administration, 2013, prosecuted around 5,000 and has prosecuted fewer each year since. It's almost as if, and I know there wouldn't be an improper motive, the House rules tell us that, but it's almost as if you had an administration that is not prosecuting gun violations so they can turn around and demand more laws restricting law-abiding gun rights. Because if they really wanted to stop gun violence, they would be prosecuting more aggressively. And when we think about the losses of lives, all the lives that could be saved if this administration would simply enforce the laws that exist. It's heartbreaking. You think about those families that lost a loved one because this administration didn't prosecute the gun violations that could have stopped those losses of lives. It's tragic that this administration will continue to clamor for more laws. The solution should lie first in enforcement of the laws we have before it clamors for more laws. Does the gentleman care to be yielded to?
From Texas, yielding. I apologize for interrupting. I was bringing news from the Committee on Rules to the floor.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I send to the desk 2 privileged reports from the Committee on Rules for filing under the rule.
The clerk will report the titles.
Report to accompany House Resolution 579, resolution providing for consideration of the Senate amendment to the bill H.R. 3762 to provide for reconciliation pursuant to Section 2002 of the concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2016. Report to accompany House Resolution 580, resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 712 to impose certain limitations on consent decrees and settlement agreements by agencies that require the agencies to take regulatory action in accordance with the terms thereof and for other purposes, and providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 1155 to provide for the establishment of a process for the review of rules and sets of rules and for other purposes.
Referred to the House calendar and ordered printed.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank you, gentleman from Texas.
Thank my friend for the work on the Rules Committee. Now, there's a job I wouldn't want, and I appreciate my friend taking care of that job. There's an article published January 5th, 2016, saying Obama announces gun control actions, expands background checks, from Fox News. Article says, the President speaking at the White House said background checks make a difference and will be expanded so they can cover purchases online at gun shows and in other venues. It quotes the President saying anybody in the business of selling firearms must get a license and conduct background checks or be subject to criminal prosecutions. Mr. Speaker, we have got to get President Obama some good help. The people around him certainly would not be dishonest enough to misrepresent to the President what the law is, but some representing to the President what is true and what isn't, because we know he would not be dishonest. So he would certainly not intentionally misrepresent to the public when he says you know, that you can just go online and buy a gun without a background check, when that is not true. If you're a criminal, I'm sure it's true that that could be done, but for law-abiding individuals, the kind that don't go out and commit crimes, they follow the law. And the law requires gun dealers, whether it's a transaction over the internet or not, there has to be a background check. But somebody keeps feeding the president false information that he passes on to the United States citizenry. We have got to get the president some help so he can get the facts straight that he conveys to the American public. I haven't bought a gun online, but talking to people that have, you go online to buy a gun, there's going to be a background check, and then you cannot just have a gun mailed to you. You have to go to a gun store, and they don't really appreciate having you buy a weapon online and then come to the store where they have brick and mortar invested in the local economy, and they're the ones that have to make sure the law is complied with. But you can't just go online and buy a gun unless you're an outlaw already violating the law, in which case more laws won't make a difference. Only enforcement of existing laws would stop that kind of conduct. There's an article from Paul Bedard, January 5th. Obama's new gun control force, 8 times the size of the Pentagon's ISIS commando team, points out that according to a White House fact sheet, the president plans to deploy 200 more Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives agents to help enforce our gun laws. He also plans to add at least 230 new FBI agents to pore over the backgrounds on gun buyers. And in Iraq, by comparison, the White House is moving to install an estimated 50 to 200 special operations forces to take down ISIS. But here again, it's not enough to simply add FBI or ATF agents when this administration refuses to prosecute gun law violations, even as aggressively as the Bush administration did. And of course, this administration seems to think the Bush administration was too lax on gun policy, but yet they won't even prosecute but a fraction of the cases that the Bush administration did. It's also worth noting that when this article compares to the actions in Iraq, you know, having been to command center there in northern Iraq myself, having talked to people on the ground there, having talked to people who have done surveys, done studies of what's going on there with ISIS, you find out this administration, yeah, they're sending planes up, but a majority of the ordinances aren't dropped. Apparently, according to one source, they are not allowed, even though they see trucks carrying weapons to ISIS, they're not allowed to take the trucks out. They see supplies going to ISIS, they're not allowed to stop them, they're not allowed to crater the road they're using. That this administration have rules of engagement in place that don't allow the United States to actually defend ourselves against ISIS. Is it any wonder that it was reported that the radical Islamist terrorists in the Middle East have no fear of this administration or of America because they see how ridiculous the restrictions are that we put on ourselves, our fighting people. They fear more Israel because Israel will take legitimate actions to win. This article from A.W.R. Hawkins, 5 January 2016. It says a January 4 White House executive order fact sheet previews the executive gun controls Obama will announce Tuesday. The 5 most offensive aspects of those controls. Number 1, the main policy would not have stopped any of the recent mass shootings, which would indicate that appears to be the fact. Nothing he's proposed would change the mass shootings. Then obviously they're more concerned about either A, putting on a show, or B, curtailing law-abiding citizens more than actually stopping the mass shootings. Number 2, 225 years of precedent destroyed without any legislative due process. Some say, yeah, but we can already have background checks, so the president's not changing that. The law is very clear what a gun dealer is. It's somebody who is in the business of selling guns. And this administration now is saying, hey, if you sell one gun, that can be in the business, and that's never been the law. This president is unilaterally attempting to change the law so that if an uncle wants to sell to his nephew, then this president would try to be a wedge there. Not going to prosecute nearly the gun violations like the Bush administration did, but yeah, we'll come after that uncle, get between the uncle and the nephew. We're going to be as big of an impediment as the way this administration is approaching this to law-abiding citizens as possible, whereas we're turning a blind eye to so much of the criminal activity is the way it appears. This article from The Blaze, Obama's executive action on gun changes privacy rules between doctor and patient. And this article talks about how it will push doctors to report patients they believe may have a problem with proper use of guns, putting a wedge between doctors and patients. Another article here from Stephen Gattal. Obama executive order may require those selling even a single firearm to become licensed dealers. That's not the law. This president's changing the law without congressional passage of law that he would sign. Another article from John Lott dated January 5th. Dr. Lott knows the gun laws, knows the gun facts. This is from National Review. Commend that to you, Mr. Speaker. But Dr. Lott points out if you really want to fix things, don't charge gun buyers for the background checks. Fix the system so it stops falsely flagging law-abiding people. His article points out that 99% of the flags turn out to have been improper flags. Number 3, stop using background checks as de facto registration, and that appears to be what they're actually trying to do. But the article from Kelly Rydell from July 23, 2014, points out that Obama's empty tough talk and says gun prosecutions plummet on his watch, with the numbers and figures to back that up. So it appears that by failing to not to prosecute gun law violations while pressing for more gun laws, makes one wonder if that's kind of akin to our service members in harm's way. For example, in Afghanistan, where in the 7 1/4 under Commander-in-Chief George W. Bush, I believe the number of precious American lives lost, military was just over 500. And under President or Commander-in-Chief Obama, I believe it's at least 3 times that many, more than that. What's different? The war is supposed to basically gone away. We ended it, according to the president. Yet under his command, people got killed in multiples when the war was supposedly over. Our military members tell me it's the rules of engagement. We can't defend ourselves. When you have a motorcyclist terrorist, radical jihadist coming blazing up toward a checkpoint, killing people, you realize, wow, we have a lieutenant that this administration under Commander Obama sent to Fort Leavenworth to prison for apparently giving the order to shoot at an Afghan on a motorcycle because he was not slowing down as ordered, was not yielding to the gunfire over his head. Well, good way to get Americans killed is to put them in prison if they try to defend themselves or those under their command. So it just leaves you with the question, who is this administration really trying to protect? Are we trying to protect our own military members in arms? Doesn't appear so. Not enforcing the laws against criminals for their gun violations, and instead demanding more and more control over law-abiding citizens in their use of weapons. Mr. Speaker, I know a lot of seniors who may not be able to tell you how much money is in the bank account, so they have someone helping them with their bank account, but they can sure tell you when somebody is breaking into their home and when they need a weapon. We were taught, my 4 years in the Army, a gun is a great equalizer. So if you're 85 years old and somebody's breaking into your home who is strong and powerful, can break your body over their knee, gun's a great equalizer. But under this president, if you're not managing your own account, look out. This administration is going to leave you unprotected against those intruders. It's time America started responding, Mr. Speaker. It's time that Americans make clear this year we want an administration in America that's more concerned about the law-abiding people than it is taking away rights of law-abiding Americans. With that, I yield back.